I think this has been a great conference. Yesterday afternoon, on a really terrific panel, Elizabeth Namgyel spoke about getting out of her comfort zone in order to learn. She talked about trying to put down acceptance and rejection, and reminded me of a beautiful passage from Jamgon Kongtrul's diary. Right before he went into retreat at the place that Chintse Wangpo would later name Tsadra, he wrote a short reflection on his education and view. I'm going to read just a few lines. Declaring what is good and bad is the way of fools. Knowing this, I have tasted, without partiality, the innermost parts of the enlightened intent of the old and new schools. I cultivate a pure view regarding all the teachings of the Victorious One. Rejecting any part of the Dharma would make for a heavy burden I cannot think to shoulder. It's one of his earliest statements on the impartial view for which he is now famous. I don't think Kongtrul was just looking for teachings he would recognize as such. He was looking for things that didn't come easy, that weren't already familiar. He didn't personally adopt every view, but he was serious about not rejecting anything as invalid. He was available to the cool breeze, to the harsh word, to the unfamiliar vocabulary, to the strange and maybe awkward presentation. Rime means getting out of your comfort zone. José Cabezón is a teacher who kindly gets us out of our comfort zone. We've talked for 2 days. Please remember that tomorrow, José has a book launch for his latest work, The Just King, at Shambhala, 6 o'clock. We've talked for 2 days now about translation and transmission. Any form of successful transmission has to respect the population on the receiving end. A religion with sacred texts that so brutally denigrate women and sexuality needs a lot of translation and interpretation to be transmitted in the modern West. José's work on sexuality, and specifically on bringing LGBTQ concerns to the table, had a huge impact, making me personally feel that I had a place at the table, that transmission was meant for me too. And I know I'm not alone in that. There is an invitational quality to all of José's work that I have long admired. I'm always eager to hear José speak, and I'm glad to have him here this morning to draw from his extensive research on philosophy, history of institutions, and ethics, and to address the topic of transmission. Please welcome José Cabezón.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Marcus, and all of the organizers, everyone who put a lot of time and energy, down to the tasting of the food, to make this such a wonderful event. My talk this morning is going to be mostly about translation, but since this conference is also about transmission, I thought I would begin by telling you a kind of funny story about transmission, but a story that I think raises some important questions about the nature of transmission and especially about the transmission of translations. So this is part one. All of you know about the importance in Tibetan Buddhism of the notion of the idea of reading transmission or lung. So we don't have to go into the history of the idea very much, which, I mean, it's a notion that probably has its origins in the originally oral nature of Buddhist scriptures and the way that they were transmitted before they were committed to writing. This is something that Jan Natye also mentioned in her talk yesterday. So the Buddha's word was preserved and transmitted through the medium of spoken language for centuries until it was committed to writing. And I think that the notion of lung, of oral transmission, probably has its origins in this. Now, Dungkar Rinpoche defines lung in his Dungkar Dzigdze as, and I quote, the process of listening to either the scriptures of the Buddha or the treatises composed by former scholars without even a single word being added or omitted. this idea of listening to a canonical work or quasi-canonical work, just as it is, without addition or omission, must have been especially important in ancient India when written texts either didn't exist or weren't in widespread circulation. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that even after writing became widespread in India, that the sutras were still being transmitted orally in these lineages of monks that were responsible for carrying these from one generation to the next. So, for example, Vasubandhu's Vyakyayukti mentions the existence of these recitation lineages, which means that they were existing still in the 4th century, that is, hundreds of years after Buddhists, before writing became widespread among Buddhists. Now, but the way that Dunga Rinpoche expresses it is this idea of kind of giving the pure transmission of the text without adding or omitting anything. The idea of lung, in this sense, also bespeaks, I think, a certain skepticism about another notion that is often paired with lung, namely that of teaching or tea. Reading between the lines, the motive for lung, the value of the reading or recitation of a text in an unadulterated fashion without adding or omitting anything, seems to imply the possibility that the elaboration through commentary or teaching might be wrong in some instances, that the teacher or commentator might make a mistake, and that for this reason it's important to impart to an audience the original text in its pure form, without elaboration, that it's important to transmit, to use a Latin phrase, the ipsum verbum, the word itself, independent of any interpretation. Whatever the case, in Tibet, the idea of lung seems to have kind of taken on a life of its own. It's often spoken of as a kind of almost metaphysical substance that is transmitted from teacher to disciple, providing the student with a necessary, even if not sufficient, condition for becoming a teacher of the text, with a kind of potential authority to be the propagator of a text. This in turn raises a number of questions about the metaphysical nature of scripture and of treatises. There's wonderful discussions at the beginning of when monks in, at least in Geluk academies, study the yikchas on the Abhisamaya Alankara. There's really interesting discussions about what the nature of the Abhisamaya Alankara is and there used to be this television show, probably, maybe some of you have gray enough hair that you may actually remember this. It used to be called To Tell the Truth. Does anybody remember this? It was in black and white, I think. That tells you how old this show was. There used to be 3 people, and there's always this idea that one person had this kind of extraordinary career, maybe, I don't know, as an alligator wrestler or something like this. And then one person had, through questions, to determine who was the real alligator wrestler. And the people were allowed to lie and so forth. But at the end, the culminating moment was always, will the real alligator wrestler please stand up? And this is the kind of discussion that you get about the Abhisamaya Alankara at the beginning. It's like, will the real Abhisamaya Alankara please stand up? So is the Abhisamaya Alankara the text as it exists in the mental continuum of Maitreya, who is the author? Or is it the verbal expression of that? Or is it the acquisition of that in the mind of Asanga, who supposedly first received it? Or what about the Abhisamaya Alankara as it exists in the mind of us, of the people who are studying it or memorizing it? Is that the true Abhisamaya Alankara? So these are really interesting discussions, and I think at some point, somebody, not me, should write a paper on what the nature of a text is and where it actually resides, and what the true Abhisamaya Alankara, or any other text for that matter, is. Okay, small aside. So this is getting a bit too serious, and I promise you a funny story, so here goes the funny story. There are today a number of excellent translations of Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara, including Luis Gomez's excellent translation into Spanish. But 35 years ago, when I was a monk studying at Tsadra, there weren't very many translations. In fact, there were some translations into other European languages, but in English, I think that the only one may have been Marian Maddox's translation. Then Stephen Batchelor published in 1979 a new translation from the Tibetan of Shantideva's famous work. Since that time, Stephen had gone on to do other things. He was, in the early 1980s, he was studying in a Korean monastery called Songbansa in south of Korea. And around this same time, I had the opportunity to visit Korea. So I wrote to Stephen in a letter, we used to write letters in those days, asking whether I could pay him a visit. And he was very gracious. He agreed, gave me directions on how to get there. Now, I have to tell you that I had several motivations for wanting to go there. I wanted to see what a Korean monastery was like. I think by then I had read Stephen's biography of his main teacher, whose name was Kusan Sunim, who was quite an extraordinary Korean Zen teacher. So I was interested in Korean monastic life and what this was like, but really the main purpose of my going to visit Stephen was that I wanted to ask him for a lung on his translation of the Bodhicharyavatara. Now, let me make this clear. I wasn't asking him for a lung on the Tibetan text of the Bodhicharyavatara. I wanted a lung on his translation of the Bodhicharyavatara. This may seem somewhat comical. I'd never heard of a modern translator giving anyone a lung on his work, nor for that matter have I heard of anybody doing this since. It was certainly comical to Stephen Batchelor when I popped the question. But if nothing else, it raises the question of the transmission of translations, of how a translation is transmitted. We're all familiar with the reading transmission of the Tibetan canon, right? Indeed, a person who gives such a transmission, who possesses and who gives such a transmission, has a special title, Kanjurwa. But we forget, I think, that the Kanjur texts are themselves translations. So how did the tradition of giving a reading transmission of the Tibetan canon begin? Did the compilers of the canon, scholars like Chomden Rigral and Putun, get the reading transmission of each text they collected and pass them on? As far as I know, there's no record of this. But even if they had actually gone to the trouble of getting a lung on each of the free-floating texts, and remember at this time, before they compiled the canon, these were essentially free-floating texts, even if they had gone to the trouble of getting these lungs on these texts, where did those individual lungyuns, right, those individual transmission lineages come from? Did the original translators of those sutras give their students lungs on their translations? If not, then how and when did the oral translations of these did the oral transmissions of these translated works start? And more important, if the original translators did not pass on the lungs of their work, then doesn't this cast doubt upon the Tibetan claim that these lungs go back in an unbroken lineage to the time of the Buddha himself? And shouldn't this cause us pause and cause us to wonder about how our translations of Tibetan texts will be transmitted in the future? Will each of the translation groups working for the 84,000 at some point give joint lungs on their texts, on the text that they have translated? Will there be new Inji Kanjurwas who will transmit these lungs on the whole of the English language canon, to future generations. This strange scenario, of course, assumes that these translators have all received lungs on the individual texts in the first place, which is unlikely. And even if they did, does receiving the transmission of a text in Tibetan authorize someone to transmit that text in another language, like English? What we might call transitivity, to use a mathematical word. Do lungs work across languages, like British passports that in days of yore allowed one to reside in any Commonwealth country? After all, a text is the same text, whether it's in Sanskrit, Tibetan, or English. And so I suppose getting the lung for a text in one language should translate into having the lung for the text in another language. Or does it? As strange and comical as all this may sound, the idea of lung raises all of these questions. And if we take the idea of reading transmission seriously, then these are questions that Buddhists have to grapple with. By the way, you may be interested to know that Stephen Batchelor refused to give me the lung on his translation of the Bodhicharyavatara. He thought the request was just weird. And in retrospect, it probably was. But it still raises interesting questions, and that's my point. Okay. I told you that my talk this morning was going to be mostly on translation rather than on transmission, so let me turn to this part of my talk now. Please keep track, this is part 2. First, I should say that my remarks concern literary rather than oral translation. Now, when we think of translating a literary work, we tend to focus on, understandably, on the end result, on how our labors, the production of a work in the target language, fulfills the goals of others, right? Their shenden, if you will, by giving them access to the work that they might otherwise never have. But I want to reflect this morning on 2 other purposes of translation. Both are related to learning, and both have more to do with the process of translation rather than with the result, that is, with the act of translation. That is, with the act of translation rather than the end product, which is the translated text as an object to be publicly disseminated. I want to suggest that the very act of translation, not just the end result, but the act itself, is valuable for oneself and valuable as a pedagogical means, as a way of teaching. So what do I mean by this? First, the topic of how translation serves one's own goals, one's rangdön. We're all aware of how classical religious texts are studied in Tibetan monastic academies. They are read and often memorized. Sometimes they're memorized before they're really seriously read. The students then receive commentary on the work from a teacher, which is the transition from the mere words to the meanings of the text. That meaning is then rehearsed, kyorwa, when students summarize it in formal study sessions, or by debating the meaning of the text in formal debate, tsopa. The purpose of these latter steps is to engage the meaning of the text in a critical fashion, to fully understand the implications of what a text is saying, to raise doubts and to resolve them, to become conversant with the text at a very deep level. Through this painstaking process, one is forced to come to conclusions about what the text is saying and to come to decisions about whether or not what it is saying is true. Whether through this process one earns the right to be a transmitter of the text is a more vexed question, since some sources would say that the transmitter, that to get the credentials as a transmitter of a text requires a deeper level of the internalization of a text, for example, through meditation. I'm here reminded of, this is discussion again from the Abhisammayalankara commentarial literature that defines what a treatise is and who is qualified to write a treatise. And I think this quote is from Putin's commentary on the Abhisammayalankara, and he defines a treatise, a tenchu, in this way. He says, Namye mebe yichengi kai dun shepa tarpatobe lamdan jisutumpa. So a tenju, a treatise, a commentary, a valid commentary, has to have these three qualities. It has to be written by someone with an undistracted mind, right? Namye mebe yichengi kai dun shepa. It has to explain the meanings of the sutras. And tarpatobe lamdan jesutumba. It has to be consistent with the path of emancipation, right? So it has to have a soteriological dimension. It has to explain the words of the text, but it also, the writer has to have this quality of having an undistracted mind. And we can debate about what that means to have an undistracted mind, but it seems to me that it implies that not any old Joe Schmo like me with a distracted mind is qualified to write a real tension. Okay, as an aside, this intellectual understanding of the text, the meticulous, systematic, critical engagement with a literary work, is not unique to the Tibetan tradition. It's also found in other religions, Judaism, Islam, and so forth, that place great emphasis on scripture and reasoning. As an aside, I've often thought how interesting it would be to convene a meeting of scholars, of seasoned scholars from these various traditions, and to have them engage in a dialogue about their system of textual education. Not about the content of the work that they study, which is obviously quite different, but about the method, their method of study. The way that Muslims study fiqh and kalam, for example, jurisprudence and philosophy. The way that Jews study Torah and Talmud. And the way that Tibetans study the Indian text is, I believe, very similar. It would be very interesting to be a fly on the wall when such a conversation was unfolding. Okay, but I'm digressing, so to get back. To get back to my original point, since the time of Ngoglo Tsawa in the 12th century, Tibetans have developed a method of critical textual scholarship that, even if not unique in the history of religions, is nonetheless amazing in its depth and scope. Now, we Buddhologists also pride ourselves on being close critical readers of texts. And it's true that the field of Buddhist studies has made important contributions to the understanding of Buddhist literature. To name just one, academic Buddhology has led to important advances in our understanding of the social, political, and economic context in which literary works were written and in which they were disseminated. This is no mean thing. And indeed, it's one of the weaknesses of traditional scholarship, in my view, that it pays scant attention to questions of this sort. There is no denying, therefore, that Western scholarship has made important contributions. But the type of critical appropriation of texts that takes place in Tibetan monastic academies simply has no parallel in the Western academy. There are many reasons for this, not the least of which is the fact that the structures of the Euro-American educational system, the length of programs, the structure of classes, and the notions like normative time to degree don't permit anything like the in-depth study of text that is the hallmark of Tibetan scholarship. Granted, the doctoral dissertation provides an opportunity for students to achieve greater depth. But this is, except in rare instances, only in regard to a single text. And even then, where do graduate students go to gain this depth and expertise but to traditional scholars who have spent a lifetime studying these works? One of my teachers, Geshe Sopala, who was both a traditionally trained scholar and a university professor, used to say that in North American universities, we teach and learn Buddhism the way that a one-eyed yak eats grass. Taking a little bit from here, and then a little bit from there, and then a little bit from there. Two-eyed yaks apparently eat grass continuously, without leaving any gaps. He was making a point similar to the one that I'm making. that we academics are jacks of all trades and masters of few, that we have superficial knowledge of a lot of things, but don't have in-depth knowledge of many of them. Okay, this wasn't meant as a really heavy indictment, but a light indictment. Why this comparison between traditional Tibetan and Western academic methods of textual scholarship? I mention all this because I think that there is one way in which we academics come close to gaining the kind of depth into a literary work that we find in the Tibetan tradition. And given the topic of this conference, you might guess what that is. It is translation. Translators, us, may not memorize the words of the text that we translate, but we read them over and over again. At least I do. We don't always go to experts for commentary, but many of us do, or at least we do to resolve the most difficult points that we encounter in texts. We may not publicly rehearse the meaning of a text the way that Tibetans do, but when we translate a work, we are forced to ask questions about what the text is saying, confronting questions of meaning again and again. Most important, perhaps, the process of translation, the act of having to render the text in a new language, in a new idiom, forces us to arrive at conclusions about what a text means. And while for many Western scholars, the act of rendering the text in the target language is the end of the process, we publish the translation and that's that. For other scholars, it's the beginning of other forms of inquiry. Some of these forms of inquiry, gender, psychoanalytical, socio-political criticism, and so forth, are unknown to traditional scholarship. But other forms of critical inquiry used by Euro-American scholars, most notably philosophy, wrestle with normative issues, with questions about the truth of the claims being made in the text, which has obvious parallels to the form of inquiries found in traditional debate. This is not to say, of course, that the act of translating a text is identical to traditional textual scholarship. Clearly, there are many differences. It is to say that perhaps translation is as close as we Buddhologists come to achieving the depth found in traditional modes of scholarship. I began this discussion, as you'll recall, by making a reference to translation for the sake of self. If we had to put this into Sanskrit, it would be something like Swartanuvada or Rangdung Gyurwa or something like this, right? To translate, if we were to put it in the terminology of our source languages. This process of translation, I think, is a unique method of self-study. At least it has been for me. I know that the word swarta or rangdön often has a negative connotation, especially in the Mahayana context where it's equated with selfishness or self-concern, and where it's contrasted with fulfilling the goals of others, right? Parartha or shendön. But I don't think that we're doomed to being Shravaka or Pratika Buddha translators when we claim that translation can be not only for others, but also for ourselves. I don't mean to imply that we shouldn't translate texts for the sake of others, but we miss something, it seems to me, when we ignore the role that translation plays in the translator's own self-cultivation, in his or her own development as a student of Buddhism. When we translate, we're not simply reading a text. Rendering a work in another language forces us to make decisions. Decisions about what the text means, about how we will render a particular word, and in many cases about whether to be faithful to the words and phrasing of a text or to the idea that the author is trying to express. Without making such decisions, translation is impossible. The mere act of reading a work in a foreign language does not force these decisions upon us, but the act of translation does. It makes of us, to use a Tibetan term, a kotak chinge, or a takcho chinge, or a darsha chinge, that is, active decision makers. I think if I had to place the kind of essence of translation, its mo somewhere, it would probably be in this act of having to make decisions. In the colophon, at the very end of many Tibetan translations of Indic texts, especially Tengyur texts, we often find a short formulaic expression that reads, Chichigi gyurshin tenla baba o. Such and such a person translated this and tenla bapted. Tenla baba in this context is often translated as established it, right? So they translated and established this text. But the term also has the sense of to decide, to resolve, or to settle. Hence, the expression found in the colophon can also be understood as such and such a person decided upon the various translation options and having resolved which is best, settled on the one that you have before you. A long gloss, I realize, but one that gets at the spirit of the Tenla Baba here. And I think gets at the spirit of translation as a decision-making process. I don't mean to suggest by this that reading a text in a foreign language without translating it is necessarily a passive and uncritical process. So simply reading a work in Tibetan is not necessarily uncritical. But clearly there is a greater level of engagement, and I would claim a greater opportunity to learn when we translate. I don't want to go so far as to say that translation is a distinctive way of knowing, a kind of pramana or tema, translation pramana. But it's certainly a distinctive way of studying or learning. This leads to the third and final portion of the paper, which has to do with pedagogy. But before that, allow me to make a short detour. So this is part 2.5, an analysis of gender and sexuality. So the organizers of the conference asked me to say something about my own work on sexuality and gender, and this is a good place to pause and to do this. I propose to look at two key terms that occur in this literature and to walk you through the options about how to translate them. My purpose is to point out three options that I think translators have. One is not to translate a term, which you've heard several speakers say this is problematic, but I believe that this is an option. Number two, accepting precedent, a term as it has been translated in the past. And number three, coining a new term. Each of these, I believe, is a defensible choice in different contexts. Let me repeat that. Each of these three options, I think, is defensible in a specific context. The first example I want to consider is the term Stri Purushendriya, Podam Moi Wombo in Tibetan. The term has typically been rendered as male and female faculty, or as sex faculty, or sex power, or male and female power. You probably know that it's a term found in the Pali and Sanskrit Abhidharma, and that it refers to the subtle material substance in the human body that belongs to the body faculty, to the Kayendriya or Lui Wampo. The Stri Purushendriya arises at conception, according to the Abhidharmic texts, and causes the body to develop as physiologically male or female. That is, to have the characteristics, primary characteristics and secondary sexual characteristics of either male or female, the distinctive genitals, but also secondary sex characteristics like beards and breasts. Now, determining biological sex is only one function of the Stri Purushendriya. According to the Abhidharmis, these indriyas are also responsible for women's and men's stereotypical ways of acting, for the fact that women and men walk, speak, and act in different ways, for the fact that boys like to play with carts and girls with dolls, to use examples that we find in the text. Here we see that these indriyas are also responsible for, that they determine, gendered behavior. Finally, the texts say, these indriyas are responsible for sexual desire and for sexual pleasure, for the fact that men and women desire one another, again according to the text, and for the fact that they experience orgasm in their own unique way. Now, a queer child, which as we'll see means someone who is neither male nor female. So a queer child is said in the text to result from the fact that the Stri Purush Indriyas deteriorate or completely disappear in the fetus during the process of gestation. And this leads, among other things, to the special placement of the neuter child in the center of its mother's womb, as opposed to the female and male children, which are on one side as opposed to the other. So this is the background now. Now the question is, how do we render the word Indriya here? Do we leave it in Sanskrit? Do we bow to precedent and translate it as faculty? Or do we coin a new term, say determinant condition, which is probably more accurate and more descriptive than the vague term faculty, right? Since this biological subtle material substance in the body is the determinant condition that causes maleness and femaleness. The choice is not an obvious one. If the work in which the term occurs is going to provide a lot of examples of how the term is used, then it may be quite appropriate to leave the term untranslated, Indriya, and to allow the reader to glean its meaning from the context, from the way that it's used. Wittgenstein claimed that this is the way that we learn language in general, that we learn language from seeing it used in context and from using it ourselves. So why not in this case as well? Now, some of you may think that leaving a word in Sanskrit is a cop-out, that it's to shirk our responsibilities as translators. But I say why? The important thing is that the concept be understood by the target audience. And if this can be accomplished through context, then I see nothing wrong with not translating the term. The second option is to accept precedent. Now here I have to confess that I am a strong proponent of translating according to precedent. Even if a precedent like faculty for Indriya is vague, so long as it's not actually misleading, there's good reason to leave it alone. For of course, we now have a century of precedent behind us, and many readers of Buddhist translations are used to seeing certain terms translated in certain ways. When we coin a totally new term, we risk the possibility of misleading readers, therefore. That said, there are times when previous translations are so bad, or the context not rich enough, that we are forced to translate, that we are forced to coin a new term in our translation. I think that in the case of Indriya, all three possibilities, Indriya, faculty, and determining condition, are defensible. I finally chose faculty in a recent book I wrote on sexuality because, as I've said, I'm a strong believer in precedent. But I think that all three are really possible translations. The other term that I want to examine is pandaka, or manning in Tibetan. It's often been translated in early scholarship as eunuch. Leonard Zwilling has suggested queer, or queer person, or queer man, or queer woman as a possible new translation. The term refers to a very heterogeneous category of individuals who have non-normative sexual anatomies, or behaviors, or desires. Although pandakas may appear to be men or women, the text considers them to be a third gender, distinct from both male and female. No time to go into details today, but in this instance, I believe that Zwilling is right, and that it's necessary to coin a new term because the earlier translations, like eunuch, are simply inaccurate. That said, the word queer is not without its problems because of its rich and very different semantic range in English, which, among other things, has political overtones. So while I have adopted Zwilling's translation of queer, I felt the need in my recent book to explain that the term pandaka has a different set of connotations in Sanskrit than the word queer does in English. And here it might be worth noting that despite what many editors think, despite what many editors tell you, we should not shy away from using footnotes. I call this the vehicle of footnotes, the Chenki Tekpa. And that this is a valid means of doing precisely this, of showing, explaining problematic translations and giving explanations of things that would otherwise be unintelligible to readers. Besides being a champion of precedent, I'm also a champion of the footnote. Tibetan authors use Chen, so why shouldn't we? Okay, so much for the aside related to gender and sexuality. I brought up these two examples, as you'll recall, to show how translators are consistently faced with decisions, many more decisions, in fact, than just choosing translation equivalents. I've also argued that being forced to make these decisions is what makes translation unique. Now to the issue of pedagogy, which is the last part of the paper. Many undergraduates in North American universities take courses in Buddhism. My introduction to Tibetan religions class, which is a no prerequisites and entry-level class, has over 100 students in it. And were there sufficient budget to support more graduate TAs, the class could probably grow to twice or three times that size. Many of these students, I have a colleague who teaches a course called Religious Approaches to Death, is a specialist on Hinduism. His class has 600 students in it. Many of these students take classes like this to fulfill general education requirements or distribution requirements, but many do so simply because they're interested in Buddhism. The surge of interest that we saw on college campuses from the 60s through the 80s may be over, but interest is still there. And my own experience is that interest in Buddhism today is more mature and critically informed than it was when I was a student. That said, the number of undergrads that go on to major in religious studies or in Buddhist studies is very small and has been falling, in fact, precipitously. This is not unique to our field. It's part of a broad trend in the humanities and social sciences that started over a decade ago and became much worse after the financial downturn of 2008. Students nowadays think more pragmatically about their major, and few opt for specializing in subjects like religious studies that they don't see as offering guaranteed career paths or financial payoffs. Welcome to the 21st century. Over the last 20 years, the number of undergrad majors in religious studies departments in my religious studies department has shrunk from over 200 to 60, to give you an idea. And this decrease is also witnessed in departments like English, history, and other disciplines as well. I bring this up because it has affected and continues to affect the way that we teach Buddhist languages in the university. Today, advanced courses in Sanskrit and Tibetan are composed almost entirely of graduate students. In days of yore, we actually had undergraduates in these classes. And these graduate students increasingly come to the university into graduate programs with advanced knowledge of these languages, thanks in large part to places like Ranjung Yeshe, which trains them very well and gives them the beginning levels of Tibetan and Sanskrit. Some universities that accept graduate students in Buddhist studies have opted for no longer teaching introductory level Sanskrit and Tibetan and simply require that prospective graduate students have advanced knowledge of these languages before they're admitted. Those that still teach the first 2 years of Sanskrit and Tibetan are finding it increasingly difficult to justify these courses to university administrators because of their low enrollments, a result of the fact that undergraduates rarely take them. This, in any case, is the present demographic of students in my advanced Tibetan courses. The classes are composed of and geared almost entirely to graduate students with advanced Tibetan, albeit at different levels. Some of these students are at a third-year level, others might have native fluency. Now, you might wonder why a student who is fluent in Tibetan would take an advanced Tibetan language class. The challenge for them, of course, is not to understand the Tibetan text, which they can obviously do as well as, if not better than I can, but to learn how to render Tibetan into the target language, English. Now, my advanced Tibetan class is a text reading class. Using the same model that my own teachers used to teach me classical Tibetan, and that I'm sure that many in this audience still use, students are required to prepare for the class by preparing the text. They then take turns translating portions of the work in the class itself. I correct them, or sometimes they correct me. At the end of the quarter, they submit their revised translations. After that, I send the students my own translation, which I've also been working on throughout the quarter, so that they can compare their translation to my own. At the beginning of every academic year, I go over the digital resources, databases, dictionaries, and so forth that are now available. I also let students know what is expected of them as regards their final translation, which must include not only the translation of the text, but also additional research that they must incorporate in the form of footnotes. For example, I require them to look up all canonical passages quoted by a Tibetan author, to find these passages in at least one edition of the canon, usually using Paul Hackett's AIBS digital search engine, and to note any variants. This gets them thinking about philological issues. I also require them to determine the dates of any historical figures mentioned in the text to get them used to working with the BDRC database. As a rule, we translate only texts that have never been translated into a Western language. Luckily, we live in a time when there are still many, many such texts. Opting for untranslated work means, on the one hand, that students might someday be able to publish these translations or studies on these works. On the other hand, it means that students can't crib off of existing translations. I allow my students to choose the text about half the time. They usually choose works that they hope to do research on in a master's thesis or a doctoral dissertation. The other half the time, I choose text so as to ensure that students are being exposed to a variety of genres of Tibetan literature. What I've just outlined is more or less how the class runs. Sometimes we spend an entire quarter working on a single text, but it's more common to work on longish passages from 2 or 3 different texts in a quarter. It's rare that we have the luxury to read an entire text from beginning to end, an artifact of the one-idea method of Western higher education that I've already mentioned. That said, and as I'm about to argue, the text reading class is one of the few opportunities that students have to really engage with Tibetan religious literature in a serious and careful fashion. Note that at the core of this model of teaching text is translation. A translation is what students prepare and present orally in class. It's what they must produce at the end of the course. Over the course of the 10-week quarter, students are forced to go through the text, therefore, at least 3 times. Once in order to prepare for the class, a second time in the class itself, and the third time to produce their final translations. Most of the work they do for the course they do on their own. But the most pedagogically important part is the class itself. Here, students have to present their translations and to defend them. If it isn't obvious how they arrived at their particular translation, they have to show how their reading is grammatically possible. When 2 different translations are possible, then there are discussions of which is the most plausible. Students have to defend their choice of translation terminology. They have to demonstrate, usually through my prodding, that they have understood their particular passage in the context of the broader text. Then they have to listen to me ramble on about the connections between the ideas found in this particular passage and other ideas found in the broader Indo-Tibetan literary corpus, or sometimes in different historical periods. This commentary of sorts they often incorporate into their translation in the form of footnotes. The class represents an opportunity to engage the text dialogically, that is, in conversation with other voices. My voice, of course, but also the voice of other students. It is not uncommon for debates to erupt on possible translations of a given passage or on what the text means. Those of you who work in translation groups may have a similar experience. While it's a far cry from what happens in Tsadras or in debate courtyards, this dialogical element is nonetheless a way of engaging the text critically and of gaining greater depth and understanding. Many of these discussions that occur in the text reading class also occur in the mind of the translator when she works alone. But in this case, they occur without being verbalized. They occur sotto voce. This is arguably the biggest difference between translating by oneself and translating in dialogue with others. Both fulfill one's own goals, but they are very different experiences. Okay, now I'll conclude. Before joining the UC Santa Barbara faculty, I taught for 12 years at the Iliff School of Theology, a Christian theology school located just up the road from here in Denver, whichever direction Denver is. There I learned a little about homiletics, the art of preaching. Homileticians, as they're called, claim, tongue-in-cheek I think, that every good sermon should have 3 and only 3 points. No more, no less. My brief sermon to you today actually had something like 3.5 points. I began with a tale about transmission, maybe transmission interrupted, tried to make a case for the uniqueness of translation for the sake of self, as a way of self-cultivation, and showed you how this is implemented in a particular example, the advanced text reading class in the university. I threw in for good measure a little discussion of some translation problems that occurred in regard to gender and sexuality. That was the point 5. Looking back over everything I've said, I'm not sure how interesting or important it all is. A lot of it strikes me as being banal. The truth is that the older I get, the less interested I am in second-order theoretical questions about translation, and the more interested I am in actually translating. I'm just happier doing it rather than thinking about it. Maybe that's something that translation and sex have in common. That doing it is just much more fun than talking about it. But the genre of a plenary requires you to talk and not to do, to think broadly about a subject and not really to do it. I mean translation, of course, not sex. Okay, this is going downhill fast, so I better end there, and thanks again to the organizers for forcing me to think about these 3.5 topics, and to all of you for your kind attention.
So we have some time for questions. We have 2 microphones going around the room. Please raise your hand and ask a question. Oh, sorry. Please stand up and identify yourself, if you can stand.
My name is Ken McLeod. I was very interested in your, and thank you for a very comprehensive, and I did not find it banal at all. I was very interested in your comments about lung, because as a translator, I brought these questions up with Kalle Rinpoche, my own teacher, and with several other teachers. And what I was always told is that the lung transmission originates with the translator. And so having received the lung in Tibetan for a given text, when I translate it, I hold the lung transmission, and I've given lungs for many of the texts that I have translated.
From English?
In English, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I hold the English transmission of the lung, yes.
Has this happened? Has anyone done this in other contexts? Okay, so several of you have. So I guess this is now becoming common practice. Yeah.
There's one other comment I'd like to make about lung. My view, and I don't have anything like the erudition that you do here, is that there's a very pragmatic function performed by lung as it was originally developed in India, because of the rarity of the text written on palm leaf manuscripts. They didn't last very long. Right. When a student received a lung, it might be the only occasion that he actually heard the whole text. And so it was extremely important within the Indian context, and that's why it's called the lung that supports, Japtenji lung. But once this moves to Tibet, where they have borrowed the technology of xylographs and paper from China, the actual necessity of the lung, because the texts were so readily available by comparison, the actual need for the lung became questionable. Tibetans chose to retain it and added a metaphysical dimension to it, but I question very much whether what its practical purpose is in today's culture.
Thank you.
Hi, Malcolm Smith here. Just to address your question, two things about how lungs start. One, there is in fact a method, maybe it varies in different traditions, but at least in the Nyingma tradition, there's a method for reviving lungs that have died, and ostensibly perhaps even creating lungs for texts that never had one to begin with. Secondly, just to also address your other question, I've spoken with a number of lamas who really do feel that translators have an obligation, having received the lung, to then transmit that lung in English, and that actually it's the translator's responsibility for doing that, because it couldn't be done. There'd be like a disconnect in the lineage, like trying to plug an appliance into an electric socket that has no juice. If you're to just sort of like receive the lung and then just randomly read some English translation, assume you can give that lung, there's no actual connection to a living lineage. Now, I know that that may not be terribly important from, sort of a text critical academic point of view, but in a practice tradition, this seems to have become important, and a number of Tibetan lamas that I personally know support this idea, which is kind of terrifying if you're a translator, really.
Can you say a little bit more about how lungs are revived when they're...
Well, for example, in the Rinchen Terzode, the last empowerment is called the Poti Lungwang. And in that text, it basically specifies that if you have a need for a lung that you don't have, or a lung needs to be revived, then there's a procedure by which you can basically invoke sort of the blessings of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and you can actually create this lung. And to that point, for example, Jamin Khensi Choki Loda, the lungs for most of the Sachen's commentaries on the 11 Lamdre texts that he wrote, the lungs for 9 of those were lost. And so Jamin Khensi Choki Lodo revived those lungs where they had been lost, and so now we have them again. So this idea of lung as being something which is, necessarily physically grounded is partially true, but really what it goes back to, as I understand it, is it's a function really of sort of devotion, invocation, and well, it's fundamentally a devotional act. When we go to a lung, we receive a lung, it's an act of devotion. It's a way of connecting with the lineage. I don't know if Tulku Oregon once mentioned that, real blessings mean that you understand the teachings that you've received. So, that's like, we won't even discuss blessings. But I think that before I became a Tibetan Buddhist, I was very interested in the Vajra Tantra. And until I received the transmission of that empowerment, I wasn't able to really enter into the meaning of that text. And even for a simple text like the Abhidharma Kosha, which I studied with Khenpo Migmar in Cambridge at one time, receiving the transmission orally. Buddha 3 trainings in Buddha Dharma are not reading, reflection, and cultivation. It's hearing, reflection, and cultivation. I think this is what lung grounds us in. So whether or not there was lungs in India, and whether or not all these sutras have actual living lineages, that lungs can be created. And I think this is important. Anyway, that's all I have to say.
Okay, thanks.
Good morning, sir. I'm Tulku Tenzing Gyurme, and I'm from Serje Monastery in South India. And I wanted to thank you for touching with some very important points with relation to translation, especially with your speaking about the qualities that need to be present in a translator. So my point is, as you and many of us know, in Tibetan translation, in the heading we often find in Indian language, this is the name of the text, and in Tibetan. So these are not the original part of the text. So, but these are additions by Tibetan, but considered very important. And because these persons, the authenticity of the text and also the valid sources. So now, when we do the translation in English, so do you think, is there a necessary to add another section about that to really, what should I say, to state the source of that text to Tibetan or Sanskrit? That is one thing. And the second thing is, for the translators, I truly believe that the translator's role is to take down what is original in the text. And as we all know, no omissions and no additions, so they are strictly not allowed. But since last 2 days, we've been hearing a lot, of course, due to your great research studies, that some part of the Tibetan, the terminologies or the sections of the verses are found weaker or compared to their Sanskrit translations. So Sanskrit, the sources are more reliable or so. So when you translate a text based on the Tibetan translation, and if you omit a part of the Tibetan verse and add a Sanskrit version of it, so do you think this is a justice to the Tibetan translation, or is it an addition or omission? What do you think?
I think at the beginning of translations, it should be more than just 2 lines saying what language the original text was in. I think introducing the text in a kind of robust way to explain not only the contents of the text, but the kind of the context within which it arose, is really helpful. And I think this is the practice of the 84,000 now, that they give at least some kind of introduction. So maybe this is the equivalent of the present equivalent of the old Tibetan tradition of Yagagedu and Pögedu. The question of, how does one negotiate between when there exists a Sanskrit original? It isn't always the case. I know that yesterday Art in his talk mentioned how useful it was for him to actually look at the extant passages of Sanskrit text and how this made things much clearer. It isn't always the case that Sanskrit texts make things clearer. But obviously when the Sanskrit exists, then this is something that if one has the ability to read Sanskrit, that it's good to work with both texts beside one another. And how one negotiates that, I think, is, there is no kind of simple recipe, but I think this is where the footnotes can be very helpful, right? Because you can say exactly how you're trying to negotiate between these two, sometimes very different texts.
Is that on?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Yeshe, and I mostly translate liturgies, so I'm very interested in the question of lung. My question for you is very simple. Does the tradition of giving lungs, as we know it in Tibetan Buddhism, exist in other Buddhist traditions throughout the world?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I don't think that the way that it does, I haven't come across this the way that it exists in Tibet, where a lineage holder will simply read the text or sometimes recite the text from memory, and the person will simply listen to it, and then this process they are considered to be getting some kind of transmission of the text, the reading transmission. But I don't know if maybe there are other experts who work on other forms of Buddhism that know about things like this. Anybody? No.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi. Thank you. David Kite. I have a kind of beginner's question, which is, what about the problem for those of us who are translating texts that are probably way beyond our own realizations. Sometimes I feel like I'm in John Searle's Chinese room, that the Tibetan or Sanskrit is coming in, the symbols are being manipulated, it's coming out, and yet if one really has a modest level of understanding of these, what do we do about that? I know we do the best we can, but it's always something that occurs to me. I was wondering what you thought.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think sometimes we tend to idealize the past. I mean, what evidence do we have that the first Tibetan monks who had just become monks, right, in an age when the Tibetan language was still developing, that these individuals had high levels of realization to be able to translate the original texts? I mean, maybe they did, but I think it's also a natural tendency for us to kind of project high realization onto these individuals. Maybe they were kind of like us, right? Maybe they were just trying to figure it out as best they could. So, you know, when I quoted this passage about, you know, the creator of treatises, of tenchas, of shastras, having to have this quality of stable mind, I don't know that this is necessarily necessary for translators. You know, I think if it were, then I think a lot of us are screwed, because
it would cut into our productivity for sure.
Yeah.
But I do really think about that, and it goes to the nature of these texts and one's own very basic attitude toward what one is translating, whether it's a literary product, whether it's the words of a holy being, whether it represents a high level of realization that one must strive to get to. So that kind of weaves its way through all of these discussions, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is an important part of the discussion. I don't know that I have an answer to it. Tuten Jimpa, maybe you have an answer to it.
I'm Tuten Jimpa. Thank you so much. It was really fascinating. The Lung question is something that I've always been, you know, sort of puzzled, and I think you raised some very important questions. And also, I take the point about there being within the tradition some mechanism for reviving lungs. I don't know about the specific tantric material, but for example, in the Shastras, when a particular text is not thought to have lung, one way in which it is revised is for a great master to write a chendel, and then the chendel itself, it's a sort of annotation on a text, and then the chendel author gives a lung. So that's one way of doing it, but that's not my question. The question I have is about the relationship between the Sanskrit original that exists versus the Tibetan and the translators' kind of, you know, negotiation of which to take the priority, which takes priority. And there are, of course, different situations. For example, in some cases, clearly the Tibetan version is full of errors. Okay, I mean, I can give the example of Tattva Samgaraha. There's one chapter where there's about 30, 40 stanzas which are in the wrong place. And that is obvious by looking at the commentary, which is obvious from the Sanskrit because the Sanskrit exists. But in order to verify it, you look at the Tibetan translation of the commentary, which was done by someone else. And in the commentary, it's in the right order. In the root text, it's in the wrong order. So those kind of things are fairly straightforward error. But sometimes you have situations where a Tibetan reading is a little different from the original Sanskrit. The text is originally in Sanskrit, but the living tradition is in the Tibetan. So in which case, how do you negotiate this? I mean, I remember Peter, Peter's here. We were dealing with some topics about the concept of Tigle. And there was a particular section, and Peter pointed out that the Tibetans got it wrong and needed to be corrected. And
my response to him was, well, you're working on a Tibetan text. If the Tibetan authors got it wrong, we have to get it wrong in the English translation. But annotate it, provide an annotation to explain. But because the tradition is built on that whatever wrong interpretation is, I mean, I wouldn't see it as wrong, but it's a one way of using it. But we have to get it wrong if the Tibetans got it wrong. So there are clearly situations like that. So what are your thoughts about this? I mean, in the case of philosophical texts like Nagarjuna's, my own preference would be to prioritize the Sanskrit. So that's one of the reasons why I've always, even to Eric, I mentioned when they were thinking of translating the Nagarjuna's texts, I said, please have someone do it from Sanskrit rather than from Tibetan. Mm-hmm. So my own preference is to really, where originals exist, to do the translations from the original rather than from the Tibetan. So what are your thoughts about this, if you can share?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on how good the originals are, too. I mean, sometimes you have Sanskrit texts that are very corrupt, that have, missing sections, that have, incorrect spellings or incorrect words that just don't make any sense, even in the Sanskrit. So, I mean, I think it isn't as straightforward as saying always go to the original when the original exists. But on the other hand, there are times when you have multiple recensions of a given Sanskrit work, and that you can have a good critical edition of the text. And then I think obviously it makes sense to look at the Sanskrit in those cases. And what to do when the Tibetan deviates from that? I mean, sometimes it is a mistake, but sometimes it's simply because the Tibetans were relying on a different Sanskrit original. I mean, that's also possible. That happens from time to time. So I think your intuition that all of this should be explained in notes is the way to go.
Hi, I'm Heidi, and I just wanted to respond a little bit to David about this horrible conundrum of being very ordinary and translating these extraordinary texts. I find that being in that position a lot, I resort to praying frequently. I mean, even just sometimes close my eyes and recite manjutris, as many DDDDs as I can. It doesn't usually work, but, or, pray to my lama or pray to the author of the text. If you're somebody great, you then have a dream about that master and they explain the text to you. But I think that's one, barring an access to an actual realized master, that's the ultimate. But stuck off in Oregon, sometimes I have to postpone that. So.
My name is Wilson Fletcher. My name is Wilson Fletcher. I'd like to thank you for your wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I'm actually rather confused about this question of Lung. We heard yesterday that the importance of oral transmission in India, and that the writing down of the text was considered a regrettable necessity, and that the Lung, I suppose, if it existed in India, was carried on as a sort of ratification of the written text. So we suppose that the Lung arrived to the point where the Indian Panditas are working with the Tibetan Lotsawas. Now, when the two languages confront each other, the thing that passes between them must be the meaning, right? And then, presumably, the Lung begins from the Tibetan translator and comes down to us. So in that case, in the translator's head, the meaning passes, which is heard from the Indian master. But we all know that in practice, Tibetan lungs are given at such speed that there is no question of any kind of meaning passing from the speaker to the hearer. So, in a sense, that would qualify as a superstition, in the sense of a practice that is carried on when the original intention is lost or ignored. I'm not saying that I don't believe in lungs. I've recently spent a long time receiving one. And I understood it to be a kind of vehicle of blessing or permission or empowerment. So I wonder if you could say a little more about what seems to me to be a tradition that is based on two contradictory ideas, namely the transmission of a meaning and then the semi-ritualistic transmission of a sound.
Yeah, man, I think my own view is that the transmission of the words is probably a vestige. I don't know that I would go so far as to call it a superstition, but it is a kind of remnant of the time when texts were only transmitted orally. And I think once you start worrying about meaning, then naturally the master's commentary, the teacher's commentary is going to come into play, or usually does. And I think that's when then words get added, and that forms a different form of transmission, the transmission of the meaning rather than the transmission of the words. So, I mean, the Abhidharma itself makes this distinction between words and the meaning of words, right? So I don't think that there's anything inherently contradictory or problematic in having the simple transmission of words. Whether or not this is historically, whether or not we can trace these things historically back in an unbroken lineage all the way back to India, I think this is questionable. And I mean, I also don't know that this was ever practiced in India itself, except for the transmission of canonical texts through monastic lineages. This was practiced. But the idea, for example, that you went to Arya Vimuktasena to get a lung on the Abhisamaya Alankara from him, I don't think that there's any attestation to this.
Wolfson's point was, sorry, hold on. You have 2 minutes.
Contradiction that Woolston was pointing out,
yes,
if I understood correctly, is that transference of lung from one language to another can only make sense if the transmission is that of meaning rather than sound, because the sounds are completely different.
That's right.
I think that was what you were getting at. Yes, I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, I don't know if that's completely true. I mean, I think if we believe that it's the same text somehow, that the Heart Sutra is the same text, whether it's in Sanskrit or Tibetan or English, then I think it's possible to say that regardless of meaning, that there is a kind of transitivity, that by getting it in Sanskrit, that somehow you have the right, you have like copyright to transmit that in another language. I mean, I think a case could be made for that.
I know this is fascinating, and I know there are more questions. I'm very sorry, but I have to stop.